it's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink. And listen. A sarcophagus is a type of coffin or burial container that was commonly used in ancient Egypt, Rome, and other civilizations throughout history. The significance of a sarcophagus in history is multifaceted. First and foremost, sarcophagi were often used to hold the remains of important or wealthy individuals, such as pharaohs, kings, queens, and other high-ranking officials. These individuals were often buried with elaborate funeral rites and grave goods, such as jewelry, pottery, and other items that reflected their status and importance in life. As such, sarcophagi can provide us with valuable insights into the beliefs, customs, and practices of those ancient civilizations. Overall, the significance of a sarcophagus in history lies in its role as a container for the remains of the deceased, as well as its function as a symbol for the beliefs, customs, and artistic traditions of the ancient civilizations that produced it. Tonight we'll see an utterly new take on the concept of the sarcophagus. The sarcophagus, by Scare in a Box. Consciousness returned slowly, the drugs leaving Lorcan's system. To find he was moving slowly down, the walls around him made of metal. An elevator. He breathed in deeply. There were those who spoke of it, the sarcophagus, but no one knew the truth. It seemed as though anyone who walked in never returned. None were missed, and he wouldn't be either. The choices he'd made no longer making him seem human to most others. The end of his life something they wouldn't be saddened by. Not even his mother would cry. Lorcan stared at the door. Escaping the elevator was an impossibility, but there may be other chances. Whatever the others had said might be nothing more than stories to spread fear into those who were chosen the way that he'd been. It was his time to be useful. At least that was what they'd said. So it was likely he'd been given some kind of job to do. Finally, his consciousness fully was his once more. The elevator reached the right stop, and the door opened automatically. Outside were guards. Each held a firearm pointed directly at Lorcan, something he'd become used to. Stepping out, knowing it was what he was supposed to do, he looked at each of them in turn before the sound of footsteps started to come from in front of him. At the same time, the elevator started to move back up. Glancing back, no sign of an easy route to follow the elevator, Lorcan waited, the footsteps likely belonging to the person who'd explain it all to him. When they stepped into the light, he saw it was a young woman who looked as though she was barely out of college. He raised an eyebrow. She didn't seem to pay any attention to his reaction. Lorcan O'Connell? Well, who else was it going to be? Nodding, not wanting to anger her on the first day, he studied her. You have been brought to the sarcophagus to assist us in our research. She gestured for him to follow her, as though he had any other choice, the guards gently urging him in that direction. This facility is somewhere you will not be able to escape. Your escapades are well known to us, Mr. O'Connell. Saying nothing, certain he wasn't meant to, Lorcan kept his eyes on where they were going. The guards were watching him closely, but if he was there to assist with some kind of research, it was likely he'd be dealing with scientists. All it took was for one of them to make a mistake. Yes, of course, don't believe me, but you may when I explain more about the work you're to be doing. She glanced back. There have been those who thought they may be able to use me as their route out. It didn't work for them, and it won't work out for you. There was a certainty in her voice that Lorcan had never heard before. Whatever you may imagine, I was chosen for a reason. Yes, I am young, however my father has been working on learning more for many years now, and he's no longer able to deal with the depth. We are under the sea, deep under the sea. He stared at her back. This is the deepest I believe any humans have ever been. During one of my father's journeys down here, he found something. Sadly, due to a lack of understanding of what it was, Both his companions died, and it was then he started to understand there was so much more to it than he could ever have imagined. And now, after many years of studying, we understand better. At some point in our distant past, someone or something built something down here. Father believes it may be some kind of temple, connected to an old god, but so far the only thing we are certain of is that we haven't yet explored everything. It's below us, deeper than we are, and you're our next explorer. You'll be going into the ruins. There will be no lights. And the strangest thing about the ruins is light sources of all kinds are useless. In the early days we tried them all, attempting to find a solution to the problem. Back when Father first found it, they used ropes, believing it would be enough, finding it wasn't the case. Now, before you're sent in, you'll be given a suit which uses sound waves in order for you to navigate, similar to a bat. We know these work, although so far we haven't had anyone return to us. We simply have an expanded map with another disappearance to add to the list. You may be an exception to the rule, Mr. O'Connell. Well, that seemed unlikely. Was he permitted to ask questions? Lorcan raked a hand through his hair, eyes still on the back of the woman leading him through the facility, someone who'd never given him a name. Or did it matter, when it was obvious he was going to be lost within the ruins like all the others? How many had there been through the years, so it had got to the point where everyone knew about it? So far you've been very quiet. It's not unusual. Finding out where you are often has that effect on people. But I am willing to answer any questions you may have at this point, if I have the answers to give you. Does anything actually matter? Lorcan shook his head when she glanced back at him, her eyes emotionless. Well, you can answer my questions, but I'm going to walk into that ruin alone, knowing I'm never going to return. Anything you tell me now means nothing. Maybe it does. Some have been fascinated by the very idea of the ruin, believing they'll be the one to find their way out. You, on the other hand, have gone in the opposite direction, not willing to think it's possible that you may be an exception, and therefore all of this means nothing to you. I've found that this has an effect on how much deeper you can get. Those who have seen themselves being different have been lost to us far sooner. Well, have you never been scared one of us might make it back out? Why scared? Mr. O'Connell, if one of you does end up becoming the exception to the rule, it will change everything for us. She stopped, turning to look at me, her eyes on mine. I have no doubt what you think of us, and the decisions we've made in order to map these ruins. Had they been anywhere else, I'm certain the government would have closed them up a long time ago. Instead, they keep sending you to us, in order to understand more. And understanding is more important than I think you could possibly understand. How were they made? Does this mean there were civilizations who were able to get this deep in order to build their temples? We know so little. The very thought of one of you returning is something we haven't dared to have, as there have been hundreds lost. Too many. At times I've argued against this, saying it would be best to stop. Yet there are those who argue that we can't. Not until we know what's in there. If it's something dangerous, then we need to find a way to stop it, although I have no reason to think it's something we could do easily. More than anything, I want someone to be the exception, to find their way back to tell us what they've found. But every time it doesn't happen, my belief in it can die a little more. One day, I have to believe something will change, and the person we send into the ruins will come back. If I didn't, I'd not be able to do my job, something I have to admit I sometimes wish wasn't mine at all. But I'm the only person who followed in Father's footsteps. He's unwilling to give up, the same way the government is. Leading us to being, disposable. Yeah, we made bad choices in our lives, so it doesn't matter if we don't return. If it was someone else, everything would be different. Yes, it would. And I don't see you as disposable, Mr. O'Connell. I want you to return." She stepped over to a locker, taking out a suit that looked like it might have been based on those divers wore. "Please remove your clothes and put on the suit, ready to make your journey into the ruin." Blinking, Lorcan took it. "Why, you want me to strip right here?" "It's nothing we haven't all seen before." Shrugging, certain it didn't matter, he stripped off his prison wear, slowly shimmying into the suit. As he did, she was focused on a screen instead of him, while the guards all had their firearms still pointed at him. There was no way of knowing what he might do, although it wasn't like he tried taking on multiple guards at the same time, when he did have a chance of finding a way out down there. Maybe that's why no one returned. Pulling the hood over his head, a small headphone slipped into his ear. "Let me know if you can hear the voice of the computer." She tapped a couple of points on the screen. "Should be coming over to you in a second." "Good afternoon, Mr. O'Connell." "Yeah, I can hear it." Nodding, she looked at him one last time. "This is where you start. Please continue to follow the path. You'll find a point where the lights stop. When that happens, you've reached the ruins." Breathing in deeply, Lorcan took a moment to work through his emotions, preparing for what leaving probably meant. They didn't push him to move, seeming to understand the situation. Instead, they gave him that time. Maybe she did actually want one of them to return, and saw him as their chance for it to happen. It's impossible to know for certain. Starting down the path, in silence, Lorcan didn't look back at any point. All he'd see were those guards still pointing their firearms at him, ready to shoot at any point should it be necessary. And it wasn't. He was willing to do what they wanted him to do, however illogical it was for them to keep sending people down into a ruin they knew probably killed anyone who entered it. Reaching the darkness took a few minutes, enough time to put a lot of distance between them and anything that did come out. Because if there wasn't something in there, why was no one ever finding their way back? Or to somewhere else entirely? Maybe there were, and somewhere within was some kind of teleporter that would take him somewhere else entirely. Lorcan laughed at himself. Grandad was the one who read him stories about other worlds, up until he wasn't there anymore, his death hitting hard. The memories were still painful. He sighed, pushing them back, the way he always did. Mom was the one who tried to use that as the explanation for how he got himself into the position he was, and maybe it did have something to do with it. If it hadn't been so sudden, one moment here and the next gone, it might have been easier. Only death was never easy. Understanding that pain should have been the reason he never forced it onto someone else. Instead, Lorcan found himself in a dark place, wanting everyone to hurt the way he did. Some said everything would have been different had he been in therapy, able to actually talk to someone, working through those emotions. They were probably wrong. Even though it was rare, Lorcan thought it was much more likely there was something wrong inside him. If there wasn't, he might have cared when he killed those people. Grandad was the only person he truly cared about, and losing him, well, it was an inevitability. All mortals died. Even he would, potentially in the ruins he'd almost reached. It was probably for the best he was there. At least his death would mean something to those who wanted to understand what was there. Reaching the point where all the light stopped, Lorcan gave himself another moment, knowing when he stepped into the darkness, everything was going to be different. Finally, after longer than he should have waited, he stepped into the darkness, losing all sight in the second it took. Touching the wall with one hand, Lorcan at least knew he was somewhere. It wasn't all a hoax. He breathed in deeply, slowly, running his hand over the cold stone. "Walk forward, Mr. O'Connell, and until I tell you to turn. Doing as he was told, the easiest task, Lorcan thought of the woman who'd sent him down there. How similar her voice was to that of the computer. Maybe they'd used her to create it, because she had made the decision to take over from her father, so those who started wandering the ruins would at least have some consistency. Left here. Knowing he should do what he was told straight away, Lorcan still reached out with one hand to see if there was a wall on the right. There was. Interesting. Going left, the silence lasting longer than it had before, he found himself wondering how large the ruin was. He didn't have any idea of what it looked like. Maybe he should have asked more questions. Ignoring the fact he was walking into something he knew nothing about was stupid. Right now. Once again, Lorcan reached out for the other wall, realizing there was nothing there. As he turned, his arm brushed against a wall in front of him. So he'd been moments away from walking directly into a wall, something he definitely would have done had he not reacted differently to the voice. You could give me a little more warning. Wasn't going to be able to hear him, probably programmed not to say anything more than it did. Unless you want me to break my nose on a wall. There was no response, exactly what he had expected. Lorcan kept walking, not feeling anywhere near close to tired, which might have something to do with the suit. Hopefully there was also something within it that would stop him from becoming hungry or thirsty, otherwise there were going to be issues in the future. Sighing, Lorcan knew there was nothing else he could do, other than think and wait for the suit to tell him where to go again. Thinking meant going over everything he'd done before, a nightly ritual for him most of the time, as he tried to work out whether his life could have ended differently, or if he was always going to be the kind of person who ended up wandering in the darkness as a disposable explorer, chosen by the government to do something they wouldn't let anyone else do. Another right. More prepared than before, Lorcan checked all the walls around him. They were all open, but he needed to go right, however tempting it was to go against the computer. Might be the way he was able to find a route out of the ruins, although if he did, was he going to be able to find a way back to the surface? Being deeper than the sea made it that much more complicated, was probably the main reason they weren't worried about someone being able to escape if there was a way out. Glancing left, even though he still couldn't see anything, he turned right. Had someone else gone the same way as him in the past, so he was simply following their routes, and eventually the time would come when Lorcan would step down a path no one had ever been on before. Not that he would know when it was. The computer might have that knowledge, without being able to share it with him. Walking for what felt like longer than before, Lorcan closed his eyes. It wasn't as though it mattered whether they were open or closed, the darkness unlike anything he'd ever seen before. In some ways, it was easier to be looking at the soft darkness of his own eyelids, rather than the hard darkness of the ruins around him. How was it even possible? There was no darkness quite as dark anywhere else, at least not that Lorcan knew of. It was one of those things he'd learned about from Grandad. Was it simply his vision? At least when his eyes were open. Closed, they couldn't see anything at all. Grandad would have been fascinated by these ruins. He was the kind of person who would have thrown as many people as necessary at the problem in order to learn as much as possible. Now Lorcan was one of the people helping with that, finding answers to a question that was beyond all human understanding, at least right then. Grandad would have wanted him to volunteer for it. Maybe he had, by following the path he'd found himself on, learning more about a different kind of darkness, the darkness someone could have within their soul. Raking a hand through his hair, Lorcan kept moving. Feeling his hair reminded him that he did still exist. He was still a person, walking through a dark ruin, only able to know where he was going thanks to the computer within his suit. Someone might have been able to find their way through a certain distance without help. But why would they try? Well, obviously someone had. The first people to find the ruins, walking into a darkness they definitely couldn't have understood, because they were explorers. It was what they did. No one sane would make the choice to delve deep into the depths the way they had. How was it even possible? Another of the questions he should have asked before. Left. Going left, not checking the other walls, Lorcan kept walking. What did it matter? He didn't need to know anything. Someone else was going to learn everything he'd found out because they'd chosen him as their next explorer. It wasn't something he'd have ever chosen for himself, but then his choices hadn't exactly been good ones. Do you remember killing him? The voice was still the same, but thoughtful. Killing who? Your list is long. Why did you do it? Oh, how long's a piece of string? Lorcan shrugged. Pain is sometimes stronger than we are. We are? Humans, mortals. He breathed in deeply, half wishing there was someone to look at. Who are you? Now that's an interesting question, but you already know the answer. All you need to do is look deep inside yourself. Who are you? Do you remember dying? Switching from female, the voice belonging to the woman upstairs, to male, seemed as though Lorcan was talking to himself. Another of the many things he wasn't able to understand. How could the voice change if everything was programmed to work the way it did? Was it something they were doing to him? Attempting to turn, to go back, Lorcan found himself trapped in place. Closing his eyes once more, he thought of the questions the voice had asked. He'd asked. Who was he? Did he remember dying? How could he remember dying when he was alive? Deeper than before, memories swirling around him, Lorcan saw himself as he was, long before he found himself in prison. The man below him was one of the men he'd killed, becoming a serial killer, wanting to find a way to free himself. Only the man didn't look the way he had before. He looked like Lorcan. Lorcan killed Lorcan. It was the same for every memory. He saw things as they were, as they'd been, and how they were going to be. Within the prison there were hundreds of Lorcans. Some were prisoners, all of them arrested for one crime or another, placed together to pay for their bad choices. Others were the guards, watching over the other Lorcans, as Lorcan, the true Lorcan, tried to understand what he was seeing. Was the voice being controlled by something, trying to make him lose his sanity, so he'd spend the rest of his life, however short it would end up being, running through the darkness, never to find his way out? Insanity is an interesting theory, but no, my task is not to break you in that way. You ought to know the truth, the whole truth, and make a decision, as you are the next to walk these paths, the next to find their way into the abyss. Do you remember why you created it? Do you understand who you are? Lorcan shook his head. It was obvious he didn't understand who he was, but he knew where to find the answers if the voice was right. And maybe the voice was right. He breathed in deeply, trying to find his center, another of the things his grandfather had taught him when he was younger. Controlling his more negative emotions was important. Only then he'd lost his center with his grandfather. Finding it once more was the beginning. Going back to that lesson, Lorcan found himself looking at himself. His grandfather was him too, a hard thing to ignore, but he managed it, as he heard the right choice in his head rather than his own. Although, if he was honest with himself, his grandfather almost sounded like he would if he was many years older. Connecting with the control he'd lost, Lorcan opened his eyes, and it was as though he was able to see the truth for the first time in his life. He was in the middle of what looked to be some kind of nebula, alone like he'd always been, something slowly becoming more painful as the years passed by. Years decades, centuries, millennia. Everything was the same way it had always been. Earth almost called to him, looking as it always had, beautiful, lush, home to animals and nothing more. Going down to it, Lorcan walked through the trees, breathing in the air, and thought about what to do next. How was he going to change things for the better? Was it even possible? The animals didn't seem to fear him. One, a wolf, moved closer. It didn't have a name then, but Lorcan knew it as it had become. A dog. The kind of pet he'd once had when he was younger, until the time came when it left him too. The pain probably what ended up breaking him. Death was complicated in so many ways. Petting the wolf, Lorcan thought about his future and what it was going to hold. Nothing in the universe. He was alone and would always be alone, unless he did something to change that future. It wasn't as though he couldn't. Leaving the wolf with one last scratch behind the ears, he delved deep into earth. Going through the layers deep enough it was likely never to be found, Lorcan started work. What it was needed was to be a safe place for those who learnt the whole truth about who he was. Somewhere he could make the choice once more, if it was right to keep up with the things as they were. Maybe the time would come when he'd bring an end to it all. There was no way of knowing if that would happen, or when it would be, or who'd make the choice in the end. Little by little, he created the ruin, the abyss, a hiding place for the truth. It wouldn't be easy to find, but those who did would learn everything. From the beginning to that moment, as they stood within the darkness, making a decision that might change everything. The very way he'd made a decision he knew would change everything for the best. Moving from the ruin to the surface once more, Lorcan started work on the next stage. Beings made from his consciousness, slowly dwindling himself down to nothing, and yet he was everything. He was everyone, man, woman, child. Not the animals, they were something else entirely, but it didn't matter, because finally he felt like he'd made the right choice. As he had that thought, he let himself forget. Lorcan no longer knew who he was. He was simply another human. From there came the billions who inhabited Earth, all of them part of the beginning. Unlike anyone else, he knew the whole truth about the world. Others had made the same journey, learned the same truth, with none of them making the decision to return. The darkness was no longer impenetrable. Able to see the ruin, which was better called a maze, somewhere his selves would wander until they touched the truth, the suit becoming part of them in a way it hadn't been before. Breathing in deeply, Lorcan sat down on the stone. If he left the ruin, everything would fade away. Like before, he'd be alone. The worst part was that he'd know he was alone. Maybe he'd remember all the lives he'd lived, able to dwell in those memories, only it would never be the same as it was. Yet humans had done so much bad. The choice he'd made changed Earth in multiple ways, most of them terrible, and Lorcan knew if he headed back through the maze, gaining all those people as a part of him once more, everything would be different. Earth would return to how it was before, a paradise. Was he truly willing to be selfish enough to let himself destroy a planet? Biting down on his lip, feeling the pain, he thought of all the lives he'd lived where he'd hurt in one way or another, traumatized by those around him, because they were traumatized themselves. He went down from one generation to the next, Lorcan's own life a reminder of that, something that broke him. Others were broken in a similar way, hence prison, being sent down to the sarcophagus, knowing he was likely to die, but that death wasn't the worst possibility, and he'd never known, never had a way to, the truth hidden in the very deepest depths of Earth, something people were going to keep exploring. Another thing he could keep from happening if he made the decision to walk back. All it took was him walking back through the maze to find there was no one there. No one anywhere. Alone. Closing his eyes, Lorcan thought of the good in the world. It existed, everywhere. He might not have been able to see it, his own pain that much stronger, but he was able to see it as he sat in the maze, the ruin, the abyss, the sarcophagus, and, more than anything else, the truth. How did the others decide? Exactly the way you are. Those who come down here have found life to be the most complicated it could be. It's part of the reason you're the ones who need to make the choice. You're the ones who truly understand pain, in a way those who are happy cannot. They aren't able to understand how bad things are at times, yet, as you have thought, there is also good. Pain was something Lorcan felt before, as he wandered the universe searching for someone to be with, to not be alone any longer. Millennia of hunting for that one thing, and in the end, he found it. But it wasn't what he expected it to be. Instead, it was a world he was able to claim for his own, to build something which wasn't perfect. Nothing could be perfect. He was fallible, so his creation was fallible. They make mistakes. Lorcan made mistakes, letting the pain get the better of him. He wasn't the only one who did. Had it not been for the others, those who made bright choices, he might have made the decision to walk back through the maze to where she was waiting. Only she wouldn't be there any longer. She'd be one of the first to become part of him again, along with the guards and anyone else in the facility. From there, it would be the rest of humanity, little by little, till he was the only one left. He wouldn't be Lorcan anymore. Instead, he'd be the Wanderer once again, with nothing. Earth would be able to return to how it was, and maybe it was the choice he should make for the planet. But he couldn't. Leaving would destroy him. Able to see it in a way he couldn't before, he saw how loneliness was slowly transforming him. That was part of the reason there was both dark and light within the human race. How he might have become dark enough to destroy the entire universe because it hadn't given him what he wanted, a companion, someone to love, the way he'd come to love in so many different ways. Maybe he'd destroy Earth by staying, but surely it was better to sacrifice one planet than it was to sacrifice them all. Lorcan's decision was made. He stayed sat in the ruins, the same way all the others had done before him, hundreds of them having made a similar choice. They chose the universe over Earth. They chose their own sanity over anything else. Yes, a selfish choice, yet it was the logical one, the most logical one for everything. He thought back to the wolf, scratching ears, one animal giving him a moment of something he could never have imagined before. It was then he knew what he needed, in a way he hadn't before. So he took it. One day he might not need it, but that day hadn't come yet. So, yeah, make of that one what you will. Not really sure what was going on there. Lots of, 2001 A Space Odyssey vibes towards the end, contemplating the meaning of life and all that kind of thing. I just liked the way it went and how it flowed, but, yeah, maybe a little bit above my head, to be honest. But, yeah, just really enjoyed that one. Thought it was something completely different to share with you on this Tuesday evening. Well, been feeling pretty awful for a few days now, but getting back to feeling good. So, yeah, lots of awesome stories lined up for you. A couple of old series that I'd still need to round off. That's going to be happening soon, so you're going to get some more of those 3, 4, 5 hour long videos coming up in the next couple of weeks as we move from winter into spring and beyond. So, my dear friends, that's it. A shorter one for this evening, but really interesting one. I hope you agree. Till the next time, very, very sweet dreams, and bye-bye. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. It really means a lot to me and to the author of the story, of course. Well, if you want to know more about me, I'm pretty much everywhere on social media. You can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can download my music on SoundCloud. I've got a Patreon if you feel like. Throw me $1 or $2. Very much appreciated. And of course, on Reddit, I have a place where you can leave stories if you want me to read one that you've written. Well, hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams. Bye-bye.